Hello, fun fact. Knights are cool, objectively speaking, and especially knights riding on horses. So that's what I'm gonna sculpt today. Except I won't make a horse, but instead have the knight riding on a reptile creature, cause I thought it would look cool. And the only rule I follow is the rule of cool. Alright, let's start by making the reptile. Every sculpture needs an armature, so I took out my ruler and I measured some armature wire, and I came to the conclusion that 57 centimeters is just what I need. Then I cut off the 57 centimeters before twisting the wire to make the body as well as the two back legs. But as you can see, this creature wouldn't survive being bipedal, so I also added some front legs with a shorter piece of aluminum wire. To give the armature some more stability and also securing the front legs, I wrapped it with some thinner wire while repeatedly cutting my hand on the sharp edges of the legs before covering them with some blue tape. After wrapping about 50 meters of aluminum wire, then it was time to add it to my sculpting handle. And after realizing that my sculpting handle was a bit too small, I decided to borrow some cork coasters and use them instead. And if anyone asks, I didn't take them. When the armature had been safely secured in the cork coasters, I proceeded to bulk it up with some aluminum foil to make sure that I will have a good foundation to work on. Clay. I started by covering the entire body in a layer of clay, and the clay I usually use when I sculpt is called Super Sculpting Medium, but for this reptile I actually used a clay I'd never used before, called Fimo Professional. I was quite excited to try something new and it was working quite well. The only thing I disliked about it was the fact that it was a bit too sticky for my taste, making a lot of dust and other stuff stick to it, but since I'm gonna paint it later it doesn't really matter. When the first layer of clay had been applied, then I started to focus on the musculature of the reptile. And I didn't envision this creature to be a speed machine. I was more or less thinking about it as a slow and sturdy lizard that is incredibly reliable. When the neck was bent to the right angle, then I cut out some pieces of clay from a thick clay rope to make some toes. Or perhaps you'd call them claws. Well, anyway, I wanted the creature to have 2 toe claws on every foot that would be suitable for moving through difficult terrain. And when the toe claws had gotten a proper amount of details added to them, then I repeated the process 3 more times. Reptiles usually have a quite rough and bumpy skin, so I started to add some texture using a crumpled up piece of plastic foil. I also used one of my homemade texture pokers to get some even rougher textures here and there. And finally giving it some scars and scratches, because you know life can be hard for a lizard horse sometimes. I gave the underside of the lizard horse some snake-looking scales that I poked into existence using my flattest sculpting tool, followed by separating them a bit more with a softer silicone tool, as well as giving them some additional texture. It's starting to look quite nice, and next up on the agenda is the head, but first I just need to boop that snoot. Boop. I attached a quite droopy lower jaw, as well as giving the corner of the mouth a smirky smile. Then adding some eyes to make the creature look even smirkier. I gave the lizard 6 nostrils in 2 rows of 3 to make the design look a bit more unique, then bonking the snoot a couple of times for good measure, before completing the face with some extra details. I added 3 bumpy clay balls to the neck before it was time to give the lizard some attire. So I cut out a thin piece of clay in the shape of a rectangle that I texturized using some real fabric. And once it had been placed on the lizard's back, then I gently reshaped the end of the clay to look a bit more like folds. I repeated the process 1 more time before adding a saddle on the back that I later would remake off camera, rendering this one pretty useless. But that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters right now is you and me. I mean, look, it's done. Great! Alright, now we just need someone to take the reins, so let's make a knight. Just like with the lizard horse, the knight will also need an armature. So in a similar fashion to the lizard horse, I started to bend, twirl and twist some aluminum wires together, and of course cutting my hand a bit more on every sharp edge in sight. And once it had been wrapped in aluminum foil, secured with some thinner wires, then I made sure that the armature would sit properly on the back of our glorious stallion of a reptile. So for some reason I decided to not use my sculpting handle while making the knight, which resulted in me having to bait the clay a bunch of times so I wouldn't squish anything I'd previously done. Not gonna lie, I've made better decisions before, but oh well, here we are. When I was happy about the way the pants were starting to look, then the knight was heading into the oven for the first of many bakes. After about 15 minutes in the oven, I started to add some details to the general leg area, in form of borders around the shoes and some straps that would hold up shin guards. I made a pair of those cool pointy metal shoes that knights sometimes have by layering 3 flat pieces of clay on top of each other before attaching some shin guards to the legs that I poked a thin border along the sides of. And with the legs completely done, the knight was heading into the oven for bake number 2. The body as well as the arms was bulked up with some more clay, still leaving room for more to be added on top of it without the knight becoming too chunky. And when I was happy with the shape of the body, then I started to add the details that would make the knight look like a knight. And of course a knight needs a chest plate, but a knight also needs a back plate, because you never know if you're gonna get ambushed from behind. And with the plates in place, I started to poke 1 billion tiny small holes to make chainmail, ringbrynja heter det I Sverige. I covered up the remaining parts of the arm with some flappy pieces of fabric, as well as poking some more folds onto the arms. I dubbed these Sir Tenderloin. And when Sir Tenderloin had ascended into knighthood, then I gave him some pretty dope shoulder guards, before I remembered that I'd forgot to bang up the chest plate to make it look a bit more distressed. Alright, according to my incredibly detailed drawing, Sir Tenderloin wants ties. And what's better than 1 tie? Well, 50, give or take. And with that said, I started to attach all of the 50 ragtaggedy ties on the torso as well as around the waist. And with all the ties in place, Sir Tenderloin was off to the oven for the 3rd bake. Then it was time to make a helmet, and according to my incredibly detailed drawing, the plan was to make a fully covering plate helmet with a visor. It was a bit of a back and forth with the design of the helmet, but I knew that I wanted the visor to have 6 breathing holes, just to tie the design of the helmet together with the lizard horse's face that I gave 6 nostrils. I placed 2 clay noodles that I had twisted together on Sir Tenderloin's head, before adding some lumps of clay that I proceeded to sculpt into a flowing mane of hair sticking out from the top of the helmet. Unfortunately, something might happen to the hair in the oven in a couple of minutes, but more on that later. In the left hand, the knight would be holding onto a shield, so I cut out a little clay circle to the best of my ability, but the edges didn't exactly turn out perfect, but once it was baked I refined it with some sandpaper. I gave the front of the shield 4 triangles pointing towards the center, as well as a round piece of clay in the middle that I gave a circular pattern, and some other additional details. And once it had been baked in the oven, I attached a small brass rod as a handle, and then the shield was done. I made a glove of clay before attaching the shield to it with a little dribble of superglue before closing the grip. Time for the 4th and final bake. What could possibly go wrong? Well, let me explain. After about 30 seconds of being in the oven, the knight fell over. Surprise! Because baking a model balancing on 1 wire sticking up its butt is a bad idea. You don't say. Fortunately, it fell backwards and only smooshed a small part of the hair, which immediately turned solid. And even though I could fix it, I'm gonna keep it looking smooshed, just as a reminder to myself. If you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. As you can see, I remade the reptile saddle to fit the knight a bit better, and I also made a little spear that will go on the knight's back once it's painted. The final thing to sculpt was some reins going from the creature's mouth to the knight's hand. Using a clay that dries in the air called milliput, I cut out 2 thin strips before attaching it to the hand as well as the mouth. And when the reins had been put into place, then all of the sculpting was done. But these 2 bad boys need something more appropriate to stand on than a cork coaster. So let's make a base. My idea was to have them standing on a grassy cliff edge, but since the sculpture turned out way bigger than my original plan, I'll only make a small part of the cliff to keep the base from being humongous. And if you look real close, you can see the giant from my previous videos staring at you. Once I'd cut out an XPS rectangle, then I drew some squiggly lines to indicate where the edge would be. Then I took my plier and started to nibble away foam to make the rock formation sloping down underneath the base. I also used a knife to refine them a little bit, as well as giving it a good old pokey poke with my favorite rock. Some small pieces of foam was added to make the ground a bit more bumpy. I also took out my little rock collection before gluing them down sporadically here and there on the base. I wanted to clean up the look of the sides of the base, so I glued on some small pieces of a wood veneer that I'd cut into the correct shape of camera, except for that part. I sprinkled on some dirt that was totally unnecessary because you won't see it in the end. And I also sprinkled on some snabbtorkande spackel, which I'm not sure if that made a difference in the end either. Oh well. Then everything was built and you know what time it is. It's
time to paint.
I started out by painting a brown base coat on all of the XPS foam on the base. Then I painted some black color over the wood veneer and let the brown color dry properly before starting to add highlights with a way too small brush. Yeah, we need a big boy brush to do this, otherwise we'll be here all night.
I was never enough for you, just say it already.
When I was done painting the rock formations underneath the base, then I went on to paint these little buggers. If you think I was done adding stuff that won't be visible in the end, no, I still sprinkled on some more flock on it. And when I was done adding the unnecessary flock and the glue holding it down had dried, then it was time for the star of the show, static grass. I added some lumps of 12mm grass by hand along the sides that would hang over the edge a little bit. Then I took out my newly acquired static grass applicator and started to electrocute the grass until it submitted to my will and stood up, despite its futile attempts at staying down. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, some grass actually managed to stay down. I also seized every opportunity to violently shake the applicator's cord and repeatedly hit the camera. But all in all, I think it worked out just fine. And to finish up the base, I sprinkled on some lighter shades of green grass, as well as some other additional flock. And then the base was done, looking all mean and green. So let's put some colors on Sir Tenderloin. I started by giving him a black base coat, before lifting him and the lizard horse off the cork base. My original plan was to be able to remove the knight from its steed to make the painting a bit easier, but somewhere down the line of sculpting this thing, I think I must have left the window open, because that plan went flying right out of it. But oh well, anyways. The idea I had for painting the knight, as well as the lizard horse, was to try and keep them to a quite minimal color selection, and also try and keep the colors on the darker side, without them looking flat and boring. The main colors I settled on was green, purple and orange, but of course I still use other colors as well. But the green, purple and orange would be the overarching color scheme of the entire thing. I find that picking a small amount of colors really makes the painting process a lot easier, and instead of using new colors for everything, I just mix them together to suit my particular need, if you will. I decided to wait with painting the hair until the reptile was done, because I was a bit unsure on where to take it. So I proceeded by painting the lizard horse, starting out by adding some base colors, just to get some ideas before adding any details. I used a little sponge to dry brush some orange onto the reptile. At first I was a little bit unsure of painting it orange, but after starting to add some highlights I was quite happy with my choice. The initial idea was to paint it green, but I felt like green is a bit of an easy way out when painting reptiles, so I settled on orange. Then the remaining parts of the lizard was painted, starting with some green on the clothes and making the reins look like distressed leather that might have been dyed purple at some point. And to finish up the reptile, I wanted to give it some symbols on its attire, so I came up with some ideas that I thought looked pretty cool. I have no idea if they mean anything out in the real world, so hopefully I'm not triggering anyone too much. I guess we'll just have to wait and see if I receive some death threats. It would be an understatement to say that it was a quite fiddly-diddly process of trying to get the symbols somewhat symmetrical in relation to each other, so I made sure to take my sweet time and not rush it. And boy oh boy, did it take a while, but I'm really excited about the way it turned out. And then the only thing left to paint was the hair on Sir Tenderloin's helmet, and I settled on painting it purple to match his shield as well as the reins. I painted the spear off camera before attaching it to the belt with a little dribble of superglue. And then Sir Tenderloin on his mighty steed was done, and the only thing left to do was to glue them both down to the base. So thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the first video of 2024, I hope you liked it and here are the final results.